Operation Ajax. The 1953 Iranian coup. The 1953 Iranian coup, codenamed Operation Ajax, was a pivotal event that shaped the political landscape of Iran and had far-reaching consequences for the Middle East and the broader Cold War context. Orchestrated by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and the British Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, the coup overthrew the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstated the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to power. The events of 1953 continue to resonate in Iranian politics and international relations, serving as a stark reminder of the complexities of Cold War interventions and their lasting impact. The roots of the coup can be traced back to the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the AIOC, by Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1951. This move, aimed at securing greater control over Iran's oil resources, was met with fierce opposition from the British government, which had long benefited from its control over the AIOC. The nationalization of the oil industry not only threatened British economic interests but also raised concerns in the West about the potential spread of communism in the Middle East. In response to the nationalization, the British government imposed an economic blockade on Iran and sought to undermine Mossadegh's government through covert operations. However, these efforts proved largely unsuccessful. It was at this point that the United States, under the administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, became increasingly involved in the Iranian crisis. The CIA, under the leadership of Allen Dulles, believed that Mossadegh's government was leaning towards communism, and posed a threat to Western interests in the region. Operation Ajax, the plan to overthrow Mossadegh, was hatched in the corridors of the CIA and SIS. The coup involved a combination of propaganda, bribery, and covert operations aimed at destabilizing the Iranian government and mobilizing popular support for the Shah. On August 19, 1953, the coup was launched. Pro-Shah demonstrations were staged in Tehran, and key government officials and military leaders were bribed or coerced into supporting the Shah. Mossadegh was arrested and imprisoned, and the Shah was reinstated as the head of state. The immediate aftermath of the coup saw the consolidation of the Shah's power and the suppression of political opposition. The Shah's regime, backed by the United States, became increasingly autocratic and repressive. The nationalization of the oil industry was reversed, and foreign oil companies regained control over Iran's oil resources. The 1953 coup had profound and lasting consequences for Iran. It marked the beginning of a period of authoritarian rule that lasted until the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The coup also fueled anti-Western sentiment in Iran and contributed to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. On the international stage, the coup damaged the reputation of the United States and the United Kingdom, as it was seen as a blatant interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. The 1953 Iranian coup is a complex and controversial event that continues to be debated and analyzed by historians and scholars. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of Cold War interventions and the unintended consequences of regime change. The coup's legacy continues to shape Iranian politics and international relations, underscoring the importance of understanding the historical context and the long-term ramifications of such events. A decisive victory in the First Indochina War. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu, fought in 1954 in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam, was a pivotal moment in the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. It was a clash between the French Union forces, led by General Henri Navarre, and the Viet Minh, a Vietnamese communist nationalist revolutionary organization led by Ho Chi Minh. The battle's outcome, a decisive victory for the Viet Minh, not only shattered French colonial aspirations in Indochina but also had far-reaching geopolitical consequences, accelerating the end of French colonialism, and intensifying the Cold War rivalry in Southeast Asia. The battle's origins lie in the French strategy to establish a fortified base at Dien Bien Phu, a valley surrounded by hills, aiming to disrupt Viet Minh supply lines and lure them into a decisive confrontation. General Navarre believed that the French superior firepower and air power would give them a significant advantage in a conventional battle. However, the Viet Minh, under the command of General Vo Nguyen Giap, had meticulously planned and prepared for the battle, mobilizing a vast network of logistics and manpower. The battle commenced on March 13, 1954, with the Viet Minh launching a series of surprise attacks on the French outposts surrounding Dien Bien Phu. The Viet Minh's artillery, which had been painstakingly transported through the jungle, proved to be surprisingly accurate and effective, inflicting heavy casualties on the French forces. The Viet Minh's relentless attacks and their ability to infiltrate the French lines demoralized the defenders, while the French air power, hampered by bad weather and logistical difficulties, proved to be less effective than expected. The Viet Minh's strategy of isolating and encircling the French outposts, coupled with their superior manpower and artillery, gradually turned the tide of the battle in their favor. The French, despite their valiant defense, found themselves increasingly outnumbered and outgunned. The Viet Minh's tunnel networks allowed them to approach the French positions undetected, and their human wave attacks, although costly in terms of casualties, overwhelmed the defenders. On May 7, 1954, after 57 days of fierce fighting, the last French resistance at Dien Bien Phu crumbled. The Viet Minh captured over 10,000 French troops, including General Christian de Castries, the commander of the garrison. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu was a humiliating blow to the French, marking the end of their colonial ambitions in Indochina. The battle had far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate military outcome. It exposed the limitations of Western military power in a guerrilla war fought in unfamiliar terrain and against a determined and resourceful enemy. It also demonstrated the growing strength and resolve of the Viet Minh, who had emerged as a formidable force in Southeast Asia. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu also had significant geopolitical implications. It accelerated the end of French colonialism in Indochina, leading to the Geneva Accords of 1954, which divided Vietnam into two temporary zones, with the north under Viet Minh control and the south under a pro-Western regime. This division, however, proved to be short-lived, as the Vietnam War erupted in the 1960s, drawing the United States into a protracted and costly conflict. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu also intensified the Cold War rivalry in Southeast Asia. The United States, alarmed by the Communist victory, increased its military and economic aid to South Vietnam, setting the stage for its direct involvement in the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union and China, on the other hand, provided support to North Vietnam, further escalating the conflict and turning it into a proxy war between the superpowers. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was a watershed moment in the history of the First Indochina War. It was a victory for the Viet Minh, who demonstrated their military prowess and their determination to achieve independence. It was a defeat for the French, who were forced to relinquish their colonial ambitions in Indochina. The battle also had profound geopolitical consequences, accelerating the end of French colonialism, and intensifying the Cold War rivalry in Southeast Asia. The legacy of Dien Bien Phu continues to resonate today, serving as a reminder of the complexities and challenges of asymmetric warfare. and the enduring struggle for national liberation. The fate of Indochina. The 1954 Geneva Conference. The 1954 Geneva Conference, held from April 26 to July 21, 1954, was a pivotal event in the Cold War era, with far-reaching consequences for the geopolitical landscape of Southeast Asia. The conference, convened to address the ongoing conflict in Indochina, brought together representatives from major powers, including the United States, the Soviet Union, China, France, and the United Kingdom, as well as representatives from various Indo-Chinese states, including Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The conference's outcomes, though not universally embraced, resulted in the end of French colonial rule in Indochina and the temporary division of Vietnam, setting the stage for the protracted Vietnam War that would follow. The Geneva Conference was convened in the wake of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, a decisive battle that shattered French colonial aspirations in Indochina. The conference aimed to find a political solution to the conflict, addressing issues such as the future of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, as well as the withdrawal of foreign forces from the region. The conference was also seen as an opportunity to manage the growing Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, each seeking to extend their influence in Southeast Asia. The conference's discussions were often contentious and complex, with differing interests and agendas among the participants. The United States, under the Eisenhower administration, was reluctant to see Vietnam fall under communist control and sought to maintain a pro-Western regime in the South. The Soviet Union and China, on the other hand, supported the Viet Minh, the communist-led nationalist movement in Vietnam, and advocated for a unified Vietnam under their influence. France, weakened by its military defeat, sought to salvage its remaining interests in Indochina and prevent further bloodshed. After weeks of intense negotiations, the conference reached a series of agreements that were collectively known as the Geneva Accords. The accords provided for a ceasefire in Vietnam, a temporary division of the country along the 17th parallel, with the north under Viet Minh control and the south under a pro-Western regime, and the withdrawal of French forces from the region. The accords also called for elections to be held in 1956 to determine the future of a unified Vietnam. The Geneva Accords, while hailed as a diplomatic achievement at the time, proved to be a temporary and ultimately flawed solution. The elections stipulated in the accords were never held, as the South Vietnamese government, with the backing of the United States, refused to participate. The division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel solidified, and the two sides became increasingly entrenched in their ideological and political positions. The Geneva Conference also had significant implications for Cambodia and Laos. The accords recognized the independence and neutrality of both countries, but they soon became embroiled in the wider Cold War conflict. The Pathet Lao, a communist movement in Laos, gained control of large parts of the country, while Cambodia, under Prince Norodom Sihanouk, sought to maintain its neutrality but eventually succumbed to internal turmoil and external pressures. The Geneva Conference of 1954 was a critical juncture in the Cold War and the decolonization process in Southeast Asia. It marked the end of French colonial rule in Indochina, and the emergence of new states, but it also laid the groundwork for the protracted and bloody Vietnam War. The conference's legacy is a complex one, reflecting the conflicting interests and ideologies of the major powers and the aspirations of the Vietnamese people for independence and self-determination. The Geneva Conference also highlights the challenges and limitations of international diplomacy in resolving complex conflicts. The accords, while intended to bring peace and stability to Indochina, ultimately failed to achieve their objectives, as the Cold War rivalry intensified and the region descended into further turmoil. The legacy of the Geneva Conference continues to shape the geopolitical landscape of Southeast Asia, serving as a reminder of the complexities and challenges of conflict resolution in a multi-ethnic world. A Cold War intervention with lasting consequences. The 1954 Guatemalan coup d'état. The 1954 Guatemalan coup d'état, orchestrated by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, stands as a stark example of Cold War interventionism, and its enduring impact on Latin American politics and society. The coup, which toppled the democratically elected government of President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, had far-reaching consequences for Guatemala, plunging the country into decades of political instability, violence, and human rights abuses. The events of 1954 continue to shape Guatemalan history and serve as a reminder of the dangers of foreign intervention and the fragility of democracy in a region marked by social inequality and political turmoil. The roots of the coup can be traced back to the Guatemalan Revolution of 1944, which overthrew the long-standing dictatorship of Jorge Ubico and ushered in a period of democratic reforms. President Juan José Arevalo, elected in 1945, implemented a series of progressive policies, including land reform, labor rights, and social welfare programs. These reforms, however, threatened the interests of powerful domestic elites, including large landowners and foreign corporations, particularly the United Fruit Company, the UFCO, an American multinational corporation that controlled vast tracts of land and wielded significant political influence in Guatemala. In 1951, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, a military officer and a key figure in the 1944 revolution, was elected president. Arbenz continued Arevalo's progressive agenda, implementing a controversial land reform program that expropriated uncultivated land from large landowners, including the UFCO. This move angered the UFCO and its allies in the United States government, who saw it as a threat to American economic interests and a potential foothold for communism in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. government, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, both with close ties to the UFCO, viewed the Arbenz government with growing suspicion and hostility. They accused Arbenz of being a communist sympathizer and of allowing Guatemala to become a haven for Soviet influence in the region. Despite the lack of concrete evidence to support these claims, the U.S. government embarked on a covert operation to overthrow the Arbenz government. The CIA, under the direction of Dulles's brother, Alan Dulles, orchestrated a campaign of propaganda, economic pressure, and military intervention to destabilize the Guatemalan government. The CIA trained and equipped a small rebel army led by Carlos Castillo Armas, a disgruntled former Guatemalan military officer. In June 1954, the rebel army, supported by CIA air power, invaded Guatemala from Honduras. The Guatemalan military, demoralized and facing superior firepower, offered little resistance. Arbenz, abandoned by his own military and facing the threat of further bloodshed, resigned from office and fled the country. Castillo Armas was installed as the new president, marking the beginning of a series of military dictatorships that would rule Guatemala for decades. The 1954 coup had devastating consequences for Guatemala. The new regime, backed by the United States, reversed the progressive reforms of the Arevalo and Arbenz governments and launched a campaign of repression against political opponents, labor unions, and indigenous communities. Thousands of people were killed, tortured, or disappeared during this period, known as la violencia, the violence. The coup also had a profound impact on the wider region. It sent a chilling message to other Latin American countries that the United States was willing to use covert action to overthrow governments it deemed unfriendly. The coup also fueled anti-American sentiment in the region and contributed to the rise of revolutionary movements in the following decades. The 1954 Guatemalan coup d'état was a watershed moment in the Cold War and a defining event in Guatemalan history. It was a blatant intervention by the United States in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation, motivated by a combination of economic interests, ideological paranoia, and geopolitical calculations. The coup's legacy continues to haunt Guatemala to this day, as the country struggles to overcome the legacy of violence, inequality, and political instability. The events of 1954 serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of foreign intervention, and the importance of upholding democratic principles and human rights. A Cold War flashpoint. The First Taiwan Strait Crisis. The First Taiwan Strait Crisis, which erupted in 1954 and lasted until 1955, was a period of heightened military tension and political confrontation between the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and the Republic of China, the ROC, based in Taiwan. The crisis, triggered by the PRC's bombardment of ROC-held islands in the Taiwan Strait, brought the two rival regimes to the brink of war and had far-reaching consequences for cross-strait relations, regional security, and the broader Cold War context. The crisis also highlighted the United States' commitment to defending Taiwan against communist aggression, further solidifying the island's strategic importance in the Cold War rivalry between the US and the PRC. The roots of the crisis can be traced back to the Chinese Civil War, which ended in 1949 with the Communist victory and the establishment of the PRC on mainland China. The defeated nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to Taiwan, where it established the Republic of China, claiming to be the sole legitimate government of China. The PRC, on the other hand, asserted its sovereignty over Taiwan and vowed to reunify the island with the mainland, by force if necessary. The Taiwan Strait, a narrow body of water separating mainland China from Taiwan, became a flashpoint of tension and conflict between the two rival regimes. The ROC, with the support of the United States, maintained control over a number of islands in the strait, including Kinmen and Matsu, which were seen as strategic outposts for the defense of Taiwan. The PRC, on the other hand, viewed these islands as a thorn in its side and a potential launching pad for a nationalist counterattack. In September 1954, the PRC launched a massive artillery bombardment of Kinmen, marking the beginning of the First Taiwan Strait Crisis. The bombardment, which lasted for several weeks, caused significant damage and casualties on Kinmen, but failed to dislodge the nationalist forces. The ROC, with the support of the US 7th Fleet, responded by reinforcing its defenses on Kinmen and Matsu and launching airstrikes against PRC military installations. The crisis escalated in January 1955, when the PRC seized the Yijiangshan Islands, a small group of islands near the mainland. This move raised fears in the United States that the PRC was preparing to invade Taiwan itself. In response, the U.S. Congress passed the Formosa Resolution, authorizing President Dwight D. Eisenhower to use force to defend Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands. The U.S. commitment to defend Taiwan, coupled with its superior naval and air power, effectively deterred the PRC from further military action. The crisis gradually subsided, But it left a legacy of mistrust and hostility between the two sides. The PRC continued to view Taiwan as a renegade province that must be reunited with the mainland, while the ROC, with the backing of the United States, maintained its de facto independence. The First Taiwan Strait crisis had significant implications for cross-strait relations, regional security, and the broader Cold War context. The crisis demonstrated the PRC's willingness to use force to achieve its objectives and its determination to reunify Taiwan with the mainland. It also highlighted the United States' commitment to defending Taiwan against communist aggression, a policy that would remain a cornerstone of American foreign policy for decades to come. The crisis also had a profound impact on the domestic politics of both China and Taiwan. In the PRC, the crisis solidified the Communist Party's control over the military and its foreign policy. In Taiwan, the crisis strengthened the nationalist government's grip on power and reinforced its anti-communist ideology. The First Taiwan Strait crisis was a defining moment in the Cold War and a watershed event in cross-strait relations. It was a conflict that brought the two rival regimes to the brink of war and set the stage for decades of tension and confrontation. The crisis also highlighted the United States' role as a guarantor of Taiwan's security and its commitment to containing communist expansion in Asia. The legacy of the First Taiwan Strait crisis continues to shape the complex and often volatile relationship between China and Taiwan, a relationship that remains a source of concern for the international community. In the next chapter, we will explore the creation of NATO's Pacific counterpart, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and the beginning of the war for Algerian independence, as well as the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet response to NATO, and the 1955 Geneva Summit.